What happens when a famous pawn shop, co-owned by Rick Harrison and his son Corey Harrison, reveals an unimaginable secret buried beneath its floors? What they found shook them to their core, and it's a discovery that will leave you in utter disbelief. Could this be the most jaw-dropping case ever to hit the Pawn Stars family? The Pawn Stars show has become a household name, drawing millions of viewers from around the world who tune in to watch Rick Harrison, his son Corey, and the rest of the crew at the famous gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas. The show, which aired for over a decade, captured the fascinating world of pawn deals, quirky customers, and the vast range of artifacts that passed through their doors. But behind the scenes of the glitzy pawn shop, a much darker and far more sinister story was about to unfold, one that would shake the very foundation of everything viewers thought they knew about the Pawn Stars. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine walking into the store you've run for years, a place that's been synonymous with Americana, history, and pop culture. The familiar walls, the towering shelves lined with antiques, and the array of treasures from bygone eras. Yet beneath the shop's polished exterior, a secret lies hidden in plain sight. One fateful day, as part of an ongoing renovation project, workers removed an old floorboard, and what they discovered beneath it would forever change the course of Rick and Corey Harrison's lives. As the workers pried up the floorboards, they expected to find nothing more than dust and debris, a typical part of any old building renovation. But what they uncovered was beyond anything anyone could have anticipated. A chilling scene that would soon be splashed across headlines worldwide: lifeless bodies, perfectly preserved, hidden for years beneath the Pawn Stars' very own floor. How could something so horrifying have been concealed right under their noses for so long? What was the secret the shop had been hiding, and how did it get there? This wasn't just another pawn deal gone awry, nor was it the quirky antics of reality TV. This discovery would turn the Pawn Stars brand upside down, with far-reaching consequences for its stars and the millions of fans who had grown to love the show. The revelation that there were bodies buried beneath their iconic store sent shockwaves through the media, fans, and law enforcement alike. But the story didn't end with the discovery of the bodies. It only marked the beginning of a long, complicated investigation that would uncover hidden truths, unravel family secrets, and point to a much larger conspiracy. But how did this discovery come about? Was it truly an accident that the workers stumbled upon the bodies, or was there something more deliberate behind it? As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was no ordinary case of accidental death. The bodies were not just forgotten relics of the past. They had a much darker, more calculated origin. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep the secret buried, and the people involved were willing to do anything to ensure it stayed hidden. The first step in the investigation was, understandably, to secure the area. The FBI was called in to examine the scene, and soon Rick and Corey were swept up in the whirlwind of questions, suspicions, and accusations. Both men were caught completely off guard. As the patriarch of the Pawn Stars empire, Rick Harrison had built a reputation as a savvy businessman with a keen eye for valuable items, a man who could negotiate his way through anything. But this was a mystery that even he couldn't explain. Corey, his son, was equally shocked. As the heir to the family business, he had grown up surrounded by the world of pawn shops and antiques, but nothing had prepared him for the discovery of human remains beneath their very feet. What was going on in the shadows of their family's empire? Who had been involved in this twisted plot? And why had they chosen to hide these bodies beneath the floor of a famous pawn shop? The initial shock of the discovery was just the tip of the iceberg. As the investigation deepened, it became apparent that the bodies weren't just victims of an isolated incident. No, the story began to take on a far more chilling tone. Each clue uncovered led to another revelation, pulling the FBI and the Harrison family into a labyrinth of secrets that extended far beyond their understanding. The authorities were tight-lipped about the case, but rumors started to circulate. Was the discovery linked to a past owner of the pawn shop? Was there a connection to organized crime? The bodies found beneath the shop were not just any ordinary remains. They were carefully hidden, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure they remained concealed for years. And as the evidence began to mount, it seemed that the Harrison family might not have been as innocent as they appeared. The media frenzy that followed the discovery was relentless. News outlets across the globe picked up the story, with headlines that ranged from sensational to downright scandalous. Pawn Stars Rick Harrison involved in dark family secret, one tabloid headline screamed. Bodies found beneath Pawn Stars' floor, a connection to a hidden underworld, another asked. Social media exploded with theories, speculations, and accusations. Fans who had once viewed Rick and Corey as TV celebrities, almost larger-than-life characters, were now questioning everything they thought they knew about the family. The questions grew louder. How had Rick and Corey not known about the bodies beneath their shop? Was there something they weren't telling the public? As investigators delved deeper into the case, it became clear that the discovery of the bodies was only the beginning of a much larger, more complicated story. The FBI quickly took control of the investigation, piecing together clues from the building's history, interviewing witnesses, and following leads that seemed to grow darker with each passing day. As they sifted through the decades of records surrounding the Pawn Stars store, they uncovered strange gaps, missing pieces of information, and hints of a much deeper conspiracy, one that seemed to stretch back long before the Pawn Stars ever became a TV show. Meanwhile, Rick and Corey found themselves at the center of an investigation that threatened to destroy everything they had worked for. As more details emerged, they were forced to confront the possibility that they might have been unknowingly connected to something far more sinister than they ever could have imagined. Were they just victims of a tragedy, or were they somehow complicit in the dark events surrounding the bodies? For the Harrison family, this was a nightmare that they never could have prepared for. The Pawn Stars store, once a symbol of Americana and pop culture, had become the site of a gruesome crime scene, a place that now had a legacy far different from the one they had built on television. As the investigation unfolded, they had to reckon with the truth about their family's past and the secrets that had been buried for so long. And so began a journey that would take them deep into the heart of a mystery no one could have predicted. What had started as an ordinary day in a pawn shop had turned into a high-stakes drama involving crime, family secrets, and a struggle for survival. The shocking discovery of the bodies beneath the Pawn Stars store was just the beginning. What came next would test the very foundation of everything the Harrison family had built and leave them, in the world, reeling with the revelation of the dark truth hidden beneath their feet. The Pawn Stars store, officially known as Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, became more than just a pawn shop. It became an iconic destination in the heart of Las Vegas. Located on the bustling Las Vegas Boulevard, the shop was a beacon for anyone with a story, a relic, or something to sell. For over a decade, it has been the setting of the hit reality TV show, Pawn Stars, which showcased the fascinating world of pawn dealing, haggling, and treasure hunting. Rick Harrison, the patriarch of the family, had been in the business for years before the show ever came to be. His knowledge of antiques, collectibles, and the history behind them was unmatched. He built his reputation on being the expert who knew the value of everything from rare coins to military memorabilia, guitars to historic artifacts. Rick wasn't just a pawn dealer, he was a historian in his own right, often offering valuable insights into the history of the items that passed through his hands. Rick Harrison didn't just start a pawn shop, he created a legacy. Born in 1965 in Las Vegas, Rick's journey into the pawn business started at a young age. In the early 80s, he opened the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, hoping to make a modest living by providing an honest service to the community. The concept of the shop wasn't groundbreaking. Pawn shops had been around for centuries, but Rick brought his own twist to it, a genuine interest in the items he was buying and selling, and a unique knack for negotiation. As time went on, Rick's business grew, and so did his reputation. By the late 90s, the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop had become one of the most well-known pawn shops in Las Vegas. Tourists flocked to the store, hoping to sell something of value or perhaps get a glimpse of the famous Pawn Stars themselves. For years, the shop thrived as a local landmark, but it wasn't until the early 2000s that things truly took off. Enter the reality TV cameras. In 2009, Rick's son Corey, often referred to as Big Hoss on the show, was a key figure in the store's daily operations. Corey had grown up working alongside his father, learning the tricks of the trade and gaining an intimate knowledge of the business. Together, Rick and Corey ran the pawn shop, with Corey handling the day-to-day operations while Rick focused on the big-picture dealings. Their relationship was a central theme on the show, which featured not just the transactions at the store, but also the family dynamic between father and son. The show Pawn Stars became a cultural phenomenon, blending entertainment with education. Viewers learned about the history of various objects, the art of negotiating, and the quirky characters that came into the shop looking to sell their possessions. But the show was also a family drama, capturing the hilarious banter, occasional disagreements, and the deep bond between Rick, Corey, and the rest of the shop's crew. The charm of Pawn Stars was not just in the items that passed through the shop, but in the personalities of the people behind the counter. Corey, or Big Hoss, became a fan favorite thanks to his quick wit and relatable struggles. Though he was Rick's son, Corey wasn't quite the chip off the old block. His charm came from the fact that he was still learning, still proving himself, and viewers couldn't help but root for him. He'd make deals, sometimes not as savvy as his father's, but always with a willingness to learn from his mistakes. It was this genuine portrayal of a family working together that made Pawn Stars feel real, even though it was a reality TV show. However, while Pawn Stars thrived on the public stage, behind the scenes, the family had to manage more than just the normal ups and downs of running a business. They had to deal with the pressures of being reality TV stars, the scrutiny of the public eye, and the inevitable conflicts that arise from working with family. The public loved seeing the banter between Rick and Corey, but what viewers didn't see was the constant strain that this type of life placed on their personal and professional relationships. As Pawn Stars gained more popularity, the Harrison family expanded their business empire. They opened additional stores, took part in various business ventures, and became one of the most recognized families in the world of reality TV. They weren't just the faces of a show, they were synonymous with the brand. But all this success came with its own set of problems. The more the family's profile grew, the more they found themselves entangled in scandals, legal battles, and controversies. Yet, the show and their business continued to thrive until that fateful day when everything changed. The shop, once a place for a simple exchange of goods and stories, had become more than just a pawn shop. It was a hub for pop culture, a place where history, humor, and business collided. Rick and Corey had established their own niche in the reality TV world. Fans came for the treasures, but they stayed for the drama and the undeniable chemistry between the father-son duo. But the greatest test to the Pawn Stars' legacy wasn't going to come from a rival pawn shop, an industry shakeup, or even the pressures of running a TV show. No, the real challenge was going to come from within the very walls of the gold and silver pawn shop, the discovery that would change everything. That discovery came when the FBI was called and after workers discovered something that no one could have ever anticipated. Beneath the very floorboards of the iconic pawn shop, hidden in the shadows, were the remains of lifeless bodies, perfectly preserved, as though someone had gone to great lengths to ensure they stayed hidden for years. This wasn't just a macabre twist in a story about the business of pawning. It was a true crime mystery that would leave everyone involved, including Rick and Corey Harrison, questioning everything they knew about their own business. The timing couldn't have been worse for Rick and Corey. Their show had been an enduring success, bringing in millions of viewers, and the gold and silver pawn shop had become a tourist mecca. Yet, with the discovery of the bodies, the very foundation of the family's empire was shaken. What could have happened beneath the shop that would lead to this discovery? What secrets were buried along with the bodies? And perhaps most importantly, who could be responsible for such a chilling act? As the investigation into the bodies began to unfold, Rick and Corey were thrust into a world they never expected. They were no longer just pawnbrokers and reality TV stars. They were now central figures in a criminal investigation that threatened to tear apart their family and the very business they had spent years building. The emotional and psychological toll on the family was immense. Rick, who had built his life around the pawn shop, had to confront the possibility that his business might be linked to something far darker than he had ever imagined. Corey, who had grown up in the pawn business and had worked alongside his father for years, now found himself questioning everything. Was the shop that had defined his career, his identity, and his family life now a symbol of something far more sinister? For the first time in years, the Harrison family would have to face the harsh reality of the criminal world that had been hiding right beneath their feet. The discovery of the bodies was just the beginning, and as the investigation unfolded, the dark history of the Pawn Stars store would begin to emerge. It was a typical morning at the gold and silver pawn shop. The store had just opened its doors to the public, and the usual buzz of customers haggling over items and bringing in curious treasures filled the air. Rick Harrison was behind the counter, as always, inspecting the latest goods that were brought in for evaluation. Corey, his son, was handling the register and greeting customers, ensuring that everything was running smoothly. But on this particular day, there was something different in the air. A sense of anticipation lingered in the shop, as the workers had begun a routine renovation project. The shop had been around for decades, and the floors, while sturdy, were showing signs of wear. The decision had been made to replace the old flooring with a new, modern design, and the process had started early that morning. Corey, always the optimist, had joked with the crew that he was hoping they wouldn't find any treasures buried beneath the floorboards. After all, the shop had a history of strange finds. But no one, not even Corey himself, could have predicted what would actually be unearthed that day. The crew, a group of experienced workers, began by removing the old wooden boards that covered the floor. These were the original floorboards that had been in place since the shop first opened its doors. Over the years, the store had seen millions of dollars worth of transactions, and countless items had passed through its doors. But beneath the surface, there were things far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. It started innocently enough. The workers removed the first few boards with ease, revealing the dirt and debris that had accumulated over time. The crew wasn't particularly concerned. It was just another layer of grime in an old building. But then something caught the attention of one of the workers, a slight resistance as the boards lifted from the ground. The worker paused, feeling an unusual weight beneath the floor. He called over his colleagues, and together they tried to remove the next few boards with greater force. As they continued, the sound of scraping would fill the air, growing louder with each tug. Then, something shifted. The boards beneath them gave way, and what lay beneath was nothing like anything they had encountered before. At first, they thought it was just an old storage space, perhaps a hidden nook where old documents or tools had been stored. But when the workers peered into the exposed gap, they immediately realized this wasn't the case. Beneath the floorboards, partially hidden by dirt and dust, were the remains of lifeless bodies. The shock was instantaneous, paralyzing. It was as if the world had momentarily stopped spinning. The workers stood frozen, staring at the macabre sight before them, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The bodies were disturbingly well preserved, as though they had been deliberately hidden and left undisturbed for years. The sight sent shivers down their spines. Without saying a word, one of the workers ran out of the shop to call the police, while the others backed away from the scene, not daring to touch anything. It was clear that the situation was far beyond their ability to handle. Within moments, the first responders arrived, followed quickly by a team of FBI agents. The scene that greeted them was one of utter disbelief. The shop, which had long been known for its quirky atmosphere and historical treasures, now became the site of a chilling crime scene. Rick Harrison, who had been on the shop floor when the discovery was made, was one of the first to be approached by the authorities. He had been in the middle of a negotiation with a customer when the workers called him over to inspect the discovery. When Rick arrived at the scene, his face drained of color, and he took a step back. The shock was immediate, and his mind raced with questions. How could this happen? What was hidden here? Rick thought to himself, as his eyes scanned the lifeless bodies beneath the floor. There was no way he could have known. The shop had been in business for decades, and while it had a rich history of strange and rare finds, nothing could have prepared him for this. Corey, who had been in the back office at the time, rushed to the front of the shop when he heard the commotion. When he saw the scene before him, his stomach dropped. It was the kind of discovery that would forever change their lives. Both father and son stood in shock, unable to comprehend the ma. The bodies were quickly covered and removed from the scene, but the questions began to pile up. Who were these individuals? How long had they been hidden beneath the shop? And, most importantly, who had gone to such lengths to keep them buried? The FBI immediately began their investigation. They cordoned off the area and began to take photographs and collect evidence. As Rick and Corey stood to the side, watching the scene unfold, they were both consumed with a sense of disbelief and dread. This was not something they ever imagined would happen at the gold and silver pawn shop. As the authorities continued their work, the media began to catch wind of the discovery. News vans gathered outside the shop, reporters eager to get the first scoop on the shocking development. It didn't take long for the Pawn Stars show to become the talk of the town, and not in the way anyone had ever expected. For days, the shop was surrounded by a swarm of reporters and cameras, all eager for a piece of the story. People from all over the world were shocked by the news, and the incident quickly became a global sensation. The pawn shop that had once been known for its quirky TV antics was now the center of a criminal investigation. The first step in the investigation was to identify the bodies. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to uncover the identities of the victims and determine how long they had been dead. The bodies were sent to the coroner's office for autopsy, but the results were inconclusive at first. The remains showed signs of preservation, as though they had been intentionally hidden, which suggested that the bodies had been placed there with a certain amount of care. The fact that the remains were so well preserved indicated that the bodies had been concealed for a significant period. As the investigation into the bodies continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a random act. The placement of the bodies beneath the Pawn Stars shop seemed intentional, as though someone had deliberately chosen that spot to hide them. But why? What connection did these individuals have to the shop? Was there someone within the shop who had a motive to conceal their deaths? The questions seemed to multiply, and every new lead only deepened the mystery. Rick and Corey were questioned by the authorities, and both men were understandably shaken. They had spent years building their business and their public image as hard-working, family-oriented individuals. Now, they found themselves at the center of a criminal investigation that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the discovery of the bodies beneath the Pawn Stars store was not a random event. This was not just a case of an old building hiding forgotten history. There was something far darker at play, something that, at the time, no one could have predicted. The sight of the lifeless bodies beneath the floorboards of the gold and silver pawn shop was nothing short of chilling. It wasn't just the fact that they had been hidden there for so long, but the manner in which they had been concealed. The remains, though disturbingly preserved, did not appear to be victims of an accidental death or even of a rushed act. They were placed there deliberately, and the care taken in hiding them spoke volumes about the dark secret that the Pawn Stars shop had been holding for decades. Rick and Corey Harrison stood frozen, trying to process the enormity of the situation. The shop, a place that had long been a symbol of history, culture, and even entertainment, had now become a crime scene. It was a nightmare scenario that no one could have prepared for, not even the most seasoned investigators or seasoned reality TV stars. Rick was the first to break the silence, his voice low and strained, almost as if he couldn't fully believe what was happening. "What the hell is going on here?" Rick muttered, staring down at the bodies that had been so carefully hidden beneath the floor they had walked on every day. His hand shook slightly, and a wave of nausea hit him as the reality of the discovery set in. Corey, still in shock, was struggling to put the pieces together. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "There's no way we didn't know about this." But the more they thought about it, the more the truth seemed to settle in. The gold and silver pawn shop had been around for decades, and though it had always been a popular tourist destination, the idea that something so dark could be hidden beneath its floors for all this time seemed unfathomable. The thought that Rick and Corey had unwittingly walked on top of this terrible secret day after day was enough to shake them both to their core. As the forensic team worked to carefully remove the bodies, the shock didn't subside. Instead, it grew with each passing moment. The bodies were covered and taken away, but the questions only multiplied. Who were they? How had they ended up beneath the shop? And why had they been hidden there? The FBI, now in full control of the investigation, immediately began to search for answers. The first priority was identifying the bodies. Forensic experts were brought in to conduct autopsies and determine how long the bodies had been there. It became clear that these were not recent deaths. The preservation of the remains suggested that they had been concealed for years, possibly even decades. Whoever had hidden them had gone to great lengths to ensure they stayed undisturbed. The fact that the bodies had been so well preserved suggested they were placed there deliberately, but the manner in which they were hidden raised even more questions. The bodies had been positioned in a way that made it clear someone had planned this, rather than it being a spontaneous act. And as the forensic team continued to examine the remains, they found additional clues that made the situation even more perplexing. One of the bodies showed signs of trauma, marks that suggested the individual had been subjected to physical violence before death. Another body was wearing clothes that seemed out of place, as though they had been carefully chosen to conceal the person's identity. The more the investigators uncovered, the more it seemed like the bodies were connected to a larger, more complex web of secrets. For Rick and Corey, the discovery of the bodies marked the beginning of a nightmare that neither of them could have foreseen. They were no longer just pawn shop owners. They were now caught up in an investigation that threatened to tear apart everything they had built. The shop that had once been the center of their lives was now a crime scene, and they had no idea who could have been involved or what could have led to such a horrific discovery. The media quickly caught wind of the story, and soon the Pawn Stars family was thrust into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons. News outlets around the world were filled with reports about the bodies found beneath the shop, and the public's reaction was swift and intense. Fans who had once tuned in to watch Rick and Corey haggle over rare artifacts were now asking how the family could have been so oblivious to the dark secret hiding beneath their feet. The investigation was slow, painstaking work. The FBI worked tirelessly to gather evidence, interviewing everyone who had been connected to the shop over the years. But the questions kept mounting. How long had the bodies been there? Were they connected to any of the shop's past dealings? Had Rick and Corey unknowingly been involved in a far darker operation than they had ever imagined? Forensic experts continued to analyze the remains, looking for any clues that could lead them to the truth. DNA samples were taken, and the bodies were compared to missing person reports from the past several decades. Slowly, details began to emerge. The first breakthrough came when investigators identified one of the bodies as belonging to a man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances over 20 years ago. His name had been all but forgotten, but the connection to the Pawn Stars shop was impossible to ignore. As the investigation continued, Rick and Corey found themselves drawn deeper into the mystery. They had always known their shop had a colorful past. After all, it was a pawn shop, and people didn't always bring in the most reputable items. But the idea that they had been connected to something so sinister was almost more than they could bear. For Rick, it was especially difficult. He had built the gold and silver pawn shop from the ground up. It was his legacy, his empire, and now it was tainted by a discovery that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. The thought that something so dark could be hidden beneath the very floor of the shop was unbearable. Corey, on the other hand, struggled with guilt. As Rick's son, he had spent his entire life working alongside his father, learning the ropes of the pawn business. But now he was questioning everything. Had he been too naive? Had he missed something? The thought that the shop he had worked so hard to build could be linked to a crime of this magnitude left him feeling empty and lost. As the bodies were carefully examined and the investigation began to take shape, more disturbing details came to light. It wasn't just the bodies themselves that were so unsettling. It was the connections they were beginning to form. The missing persons reports, the strange history of the shop, and the clues that had been left behind pointed to a conspiracy far bigger than anyone had expected. The bodies beneath the Pawn Star store were not just relics of an isolated incident. They were part of a much larger puzzle. And as the investigation deepened, Rick and Corey were faced with the harsh reality that their family business might have been built on secrets far darker than they had ever imagined. The discovery of the bodies beneath the gold and silver pawn shop had set off a chain of events that none of the Harrison family could have predicted. The initial shock of finding the remains had faded into a harsh reality, and now the FBI was in control of the investigation. This wasn't just any crime scene. It was one involving two reality TV stars who had been the faces of a popular television show for over a decade. With millions of viewers tuning in each week to watch the daily dealings of Rick and Corey Harrison, this discovery had gone beyond a local incident. It was now an international story. The FBI agents who arrived at the scene were seasoned professionals. They knew how to handle crime scenes, how to piece together the smallest of clues, and how to keep their composure under the weight of a shocking discovery like this. But even they were taken aback by the magnitude of what they had uncovered beneath the pawn shop. This wasn't just a case of hidden bodies. It was a case that could unravel an entire community and expose dark secrets buried in plain sight. As soon as the FBI took over, they immediately began their work of securing the scene, cataloging evidence, and interviewing the first responders. The workers who had discovered the bodies were interviewed at length, each one explaining what they had seen and how they had reacted to the gruesome find. Despite their best efforts to maintain calm, their fear and confusion were palpable. They had walked into a routine renovation expecting little more than some old dust and dirt. Instead, they had unearthed a horror that none of them were prepared for. Rick and Corey, who had initially been swept up in the chaos of the moment, were now dealing with the realization that their beloved pawn shop was the center of a criminal investigation. For Rick, the shock was compounded by the fact that his reputation, something he had worked so hard to build, was now in jeopardy. The Pawn Stars brand was built on the idea of the family business, built on trust, and built on the integrity of being honest brokers of history and culture. Now, the family was facing a crisis unlike any they had ever imagined. The first thing the FBI did was begin a meticulous investigation into the history of the shop. Forensic experts were brought in to analyze the remains of the bodies and determine how long they had been hidden beneath the floorboards. The goal was to pinpoint the time of death, identify the bodies, and uncover any clues that might reveal who had been involved in this heinous act. The forensic team quickly determined that the bodies had been hidden for decades. The preservation of the remains was extraordinary, suggesting that whoever had concealed the bodies had gone to great lengths to ensure they remained untouched by time. The bodies were carefully transported to a local morgue for further analysis, where pathologists would work to uncover more information about the cause of death and the identities of the victims. Meanwhile, the FBI's criminal investigators began to dig into the shop's records. They meticulously reviewed old business transactions, employee rosters, and customer histories. Rick and Corey had long prided themselves on running an honest business, but now everything was under the microscope. Every transaction, every deal, every relationship the family had built with the public was now suspect. Were there any connections between the shop's dealings and the discovery of the bodies? Could someone within their circle have been involved in a criminal enterprise? At first, the investigation yielded little. The shop's history, while extensive, was largely uneventful in terms of illegal activity. But as the investigation deepened, patterns began to emerge. There were discrepancies in some of the store's old records, strange gaps in time when certain items had been bought and sold, and several individuals associated with the shop who had mysteriously disappeared over the years. It was clear that the Harrison family's business dealings weren't as innocent as they had appeared. As the FBI dug further, they uncovered an unsettling pattern of disappearances tied to the Pawn Stars shop. People who had entered the store in search of selling their items, or who had worked there in the past, had vanished without a trace. Some had been employees who had abruptly quit without explanation. Others had been customers who had come in with items of significant value, only to never be seen again. The FBI began to wonder if these disappearances were connected to the bodies found beneath the floor. The investigation into the shop's history became a massive undertaking, with agents tracing records back decades. What the FBI soon realized was that the gold and silver pawn shop was not just a pawn store, it was a piece of a much larger puzzle. The store had become a central point in a network of illegal activity that stretched far beyond the confines of the pawn industry. Whether Rick and Corey had been unwittingly involved or were simply victims of circumstance remained to be seen. The Harrison family, now the focus of a nationwide investigation, found themselves fighting to clear their names. Rick was determined to prove his innocence, but the more the FBI uncovered, the harder it became to maintain his own sense of certainty. The Pawn Stars brand had been built on the idea of honesty and integrity, yet now the very foundation of that image was crumbling. Corey, who had always been Rick's trusted ally in the pawn shop, struggled to deal with the emotional weight of the investigation. He had spent his entire life working alongside his father, learning the ins and outs of the business, and yet now it seemed as though everything they had built was collapsing before their eyes. It was hard for Corey to accept that something so sinister could have been hidden for so long in their shop. He had never suspected that their success had come at such a high cost. As the investigation dragged on, the media attention grew more intense. Reporters camped outside the shop, desperate for new developments in the case. The once popular Pawn Stars show had become the focal point of an ongoing crime saga. Each new piece of evidence the FBI uncovered was met with a fresh wave of speculation and sensationalism from the press. The Harrison family had once been beloved TV stars, but now they were being painted as potential criminals. Rick and Corey were forced to take a step back from their business. They couldn't continue operating the pawn shop while the FBI investigation was ongoing, so the shop remained closed to the public. This only added fuel to the fire of public suspicion. Fans of the show who had once admired the Harrison family for their wit and charm now questioned everything. Were they really the upstanding businessmen they portrayed on television? Or was there something much darker lurking beneath the surface? It was a painful process for the family, watching their lives unravel in front of the world. Rick, who had spent years building his empire, found himself in an unfamiliar position, one where the very foundation of his success was being called into question. Corey, ever the hopeful son, tried to maintain his optimism, but the pressure was overwhelming. The discovery of the bodies had changed everything, and the FBI investigation was only beginning to scratch the surface of what was really going on at the gold and silver pawn shop. As the investigation into the gold and silver pawn shop's hidden past continued, new revelations began to emerge, each one more disturbing than the last. The FBI had already made one shocking discovery, the bodies buried beneath the shop's floor. But the deeper they dug, the more it became clear that this was not an isolated incident. The bodies were not just remnants of some long-forgotten crime. They were part of a much larger, more sinister narrative that stretched far beyond the pawn shop. The FBI had initially focused on identifying the victims, hoping to piece together their stories and uncover their connections to the shop. But as they pored over missing persons reports, they discovered that the individuals whose bodies had been found were not random. They were all linked to the pawn shop in some way, though their relationships to Rick and Corey Harrison were not immediately clear. The first breakthrough came when one of the bodies was identified as a man named Robert "Bobby" Turner. Bobby had been a regular customer at the pawn shop for years, often coming in with valuable items that he had acquired through various means. He was well known in Las Vegas for his connections to the underground world of smuggling and black market dealings. The FBI had no idea how Bobby Turner had ended up beneath the Pawn Stars floor, but it was becoming increasingly evident that the shop, or at least someone connected to it, had played a role in his mysterious disappearance. Rick and Corey were horrified when they learned that Bobby Turner's name had come up in connection to the bodies. They had known Bobby, of course. He had come into the shop on numerous occasions, but they had never suspected anything beyond his occasional dealings with valuable items. Bobby was a figure from the world that Rick and Corey had always worked hard to avoid. He was involved in shady deals and had ties to criminal organizations, but Rick had always managed to keep his business above board, or so he thought. The more the FBI uncovered, the more it became clear that Bobby Turner wasn't the only person with ties to the pawn shop who had gone missing over the years. Several other bodies were linked to individuals who had been customers or employees of the gold and silver pawn shop, each with their own strange backstory. One of the bodies was identified as a man named Richard Moore, who had been a regular customer in the early years of the shop's operation. He had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind no clues or evidence of his whereabouts. Another victim was a woman named Jessica Patel, a former employee who had mysteriously vanished after working at the shop for several years. Her disappearance had been marked as a simple case of a person leaving without notice, but now the truth was coming to light. She had likely been murdered and hidden beneath the shop's floor. As the investigation unfolded, the FBI began to connect the dots. These individuals were not just random victims. They were part of a larger network of people who had crossed paths with the Pawn Stars family. What began as a routine investigation into a missing person case had now become something far darker, a web of criminal activity that stretched across years, involving not just the shop, but those who frequented it and the hidden world of underground dealings that had operated beneath the surface of the Las Vegas community. The connection between the Pawn Stars shop and the bodies became more apparent with each passing day. What had once seemed like a fluke discovery, a few bodies hidden beneath the floor, was now looking like something much more deliberate. The shop had been operating as a hub for illegal activities, a place where stolen goods, black market items, and other illicit treasures could be exchanged without much scrutiny. Rick and Corey had always claimed to run an honest business, but the evidence was starting to suggest otherwise. Their shop had become more than just a pawn shop. It had become a front for a much larger criminal operation. For Rick, the revelation was devastating. He had spent his entire life building the Pawn Stars brand, carefully crafting an image of trust and reliability. The shop had been his pride and joy, and the success of the TV show had only reinforced that image. He had always prided himself on knowing the history and value of every item that passed through his hands, but now it seemed that the very place he had built his empire on was tied to a much darker past. Corey, too, was struggling to come to terms with the investigation. He had grown up working at the pawn shop, learning the business from his father. To him, the shop had always been a place of honesty and hard work, a place where he could build his future. The idea that it had been used as a front for something so sinister was a bitter pill to swallow. The more the investigation unfolded, the more Corey began to question everything he had ever known about his father and the pawn business. The FBI agents, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to uncover more evidence. They dug into the shop's financial records, looking for any signs of money laundering or illegal transactions. The records were a maze of transactions, some of which appeared legitimate, but many others seemed to have been purposefully hidden. There were gaps in the documentation, unexplained deposits, and strange transactions that didn't add up. It seemed as though someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. One of the most puzzling aspects of the investigation was the connection between the bodies found beneath the floor and the items that had been pawned at the shop over the years. As the FBI dug deeper into the records, they discovered that many of the items brought in for sale had been linked to individuals who were later found to have connections to the missing persons. Stolen goods, illicit treasures, and black market items had passed through the shop's doors, but no one had ever raised a red flag. It was as if the shop had become a trusted conduit for the illegal underground economy of Las Vegas, a place where the lines between legitimate business and criminal activity had blurred beyond recognition. As the investigation grew more complex, the Harrison family found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. Rick, who had always been the face of the Pawn Stars brand, was now forced to confront the possibility that his business had become entangled in a criminal underworld that he had never intended to be a part of. Corey, too, was feeling the weight of the situation. He had always believed in his father's vision, but now he was left to wonder whether he had been blind to the darker forces at work behind the scenes. Despite their best efforts to distance themselves from the growing scandal, the media coverage only intensified. The Pawn Stars brand, once a beloved part of American pop culture, was now being scrutinized under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The world watched as the FBI investigation uncovered more and more damning evidence, with each new revelation only adding fuel to the fire. The bodies, once buried beneath the floorboards of the pawn shop, were now the center of a mystery that was rapidly spiraling out of control. The FBI had uncovered a network of criminal activity that involved not just the shop, but individuals from across the criminal underworld. The investigation was becoming more than just about solving the murders. It was about exposing a hidden world of corruption, deceit, and betrayal that had been operating under the surface of the Pawn Stars empire for decades. For Rick and Corey, the investigation was a bitter reminder of just how fragile their world had become. They had built their success on a foundation of hard work and trust, but now that foundation was crumbling beneath them. The shop that had been a symbol of American enterprise was now a crime scene, a place where dark secrets had been hidden for far too long. The secrets beneath the floor were not just buried bodies, they were a reflection of a much larger story, one that would unravel not only the Harrison family's legacy but the very fabric of the Pawn Stars empire itself. As the investigation into the gold and silver pawn shop deepened, so did the theories and speculations surrounding the discovery of the bodies beneath the shop's floor. With each new piece of evidence uncovered by the FBI, the mystery only grew more complex. What had started as a routine renovation project had quickly spiraled into an investigation that threatened to unravel everything the Pawn Stars family had built over the years. Rick and Corey Harrison, once regarded as icons in the world of reality TV, found themselves at the center of a media frenzy. The public's fascination with the case was immense, with news outlets around the world eagerly reporting every new detail that emerged. But as the investigation continued, it became clear that the truth was far more elusive than anyone could have imagined. Theories about the origins of the bodies and their connection to the pawn shop began to flood the media. Some speculated that the bodies were victims of an old criminal operation tied to organized crime syndicates operating in Las Vegas during the early days of the shop. Others believed that the bodies might be connected to a long-forgotten scandal involving corrupt individuals who had once frequented the shop. And then there were those who suggested that the Harrison family might have been unknowingly involved in something much darker than they could ever have anticipated. The most popular theory among the media was that the bodies had been buried beneath the shop as part of a larger conspiracy. The idea was that the shop had been used as a front for illegal activity, money laundering, black market deals, and perhaps even human trafficking. The fact that the bodies were well preserved and hidden so carefully only fueled the speculation. Why would someone go to such lengths to conceal the bodies if it wasn't part of something much larger? As the FBI continued their investigation, the idea of a hidden criminal enterprise began to take shape. They uncovered evidence of illicit transactions that had been conducted through the pawn shop over the years. Stolen goods, black market artifacts, and counterfeit items had all passed through the shop's doors, but the question remained. Was the Harrison family aware of the scale of the operation, or had they been unwitting participants in something much darker? Rick and Corey both vehemently denied any involvement in illegal activity. They maintained that they had always run an honest business, providing a legitimate service to the community. But as the evidence mounted, their public statements began to ring hollow. The FBI found discrepancies in their records, unexplained financial transactions, and strange connections to individuals with ties to organized crime. Was it possible that Rick and Corey had been kept in the dark, or were they more involved than they were letting on? Another theory that gained traction was that the bodies had been buried by a former employee who had become involved in criminal activity. Over the years, several employees had come and gone from the pawn shop, and some had been involved in questionable dealings. Could one of them have been hiding a dark secret? Had someone who once worked at the shop used it as a cover for a much more sinister operation, burying the bodies beneath the floor to hide their crimes? The idea that the shop's history might hold the key to the mystery was another theory that began to emerge. The gold and silver pawn shop had been around for decades, and during that time, it had seen its fair share of strange and suspicious characters. Many of the shop's customers had ties to the criminal underworld, and the shop had occasionally been a place where valuable stolen items were exchanged. Could one of these shady figures have been responsible for the deaths? And if so, what was their connection to the Pawn Stars family? Rick and Corey both struggled to comprehend the mounting evidence. The idea that their shop, their family business, had been involved in such dark activities was difficult to accept. For years, they had built their reputation on providing a legitimate service to their customers. They had never imagined that something so sinister could be lurking beneath the surface. As the investigation continued, they were forced to confront the possibility that the shop had been used as a cover for criminal activity they hadn't been aware of. Theories about the origin of the bodies continued to evolve as more information came to light. Some investigators suggested that the bodies were victims of a long-running smuggling operation that had been running under the radar for years. The pawn shop had been the perfect front for such an operation, with its steady stream of customers coming and going, and the opportunity to launder illicit goods through seemingly legitimate transactions. The idea that the shop had been complicit in such an operation was difficult for Rick and Corey to accept, but the mounting evidence made it hard to ignore. Others speculated that the bodies were connected to a more personal tragedy, a family member or close associate who had been killed and hidden away by someone close to the Harrison family. This theory gained some traction when it was revealed that there had been a number of personal tragedies in the family's past, unexplained disappearances and mysterious deaths that had never been fully explained. Had someone close to Rick or Corey been involved in the deaths? And if so, why would they hide the bodies beneath the shop? As the theories continued to circulate, the public's fascination with the case only grew. News outlets and social media platforms were filled with speculation, and the Pawn Stars brand became the subject of countless online discussions. People who had once admired Rick and Corey were now questioning their integrity and involvement in the scandal. The Pawn Stars brand, which had been built on a foundation of trust and authenticity, was now mired in suspicion and scandal. Despite the overwhelming media attention, the FBI remained focused on the facts. They continued to dig through old records, interview witnesses, and trace the connections between the bodies and the Pawn Stars shop. But with each new lead, the case only grew more complex. The evidence pointed to a web of criminal activity that stretched far beyond the walls of the pawn shop, and the deeper they dug, the more tangled the mystery became. Theories about the bodies and the shop's role in the conspiracy began to converge, with the FBI slowly piecing together the larger picture. They began to suspect that the Pawn Stars shop had been a key player in a much larger criminal network, one that had been operating in the shadows of Las Vegas for decades. The shop had become a hub for illegal activity, money laundering, stolen goods, and black market transactions, but what was its ultimate purpose? And who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes? Rick and Corey, meanwhile, found themselves struggling to defend their family's reputation. They had built their lives on the success of the Pawn Stars brand, and now everything was in jeopardy. The theories and speculations were taking a toll on both men. The weight of the investigation and the mounting evidence was proving to be unbearable. As they tried to make sense of the accusations, they were forced to confront their own complicity, whether it was intentional or not, in a scandal that had rocked their world. The truth, it seemed, was buried beneath layers of secrecy, and as the investigation continued, it became clear that uncovering that truth would require more than just a few answers. It would require exposing the dark underbelly of the Pawn Stars empire. An empire built on the exchange of rare and valuable items, but with a far more sinister foundation than anyone could have ever imagined. The FBI's investigation into the gold and silver pawn shop and its connection to the bodies found beneath the floorboards had only just begun, but the depth of the case was already becoming apparent. What had initially seemed like a tragic but isolated discovery was quickly evolving into a sprawling investigation that threatened to expose a network of criminal activity tied to one of the most beloved TV shows in the world. As the weeks passed, the investigation moved forward at a breakneck pace. Forensic teams continued to analyze the bodies, working to uncover the cause of death and the identities of the victims. Meanwhile, the FBI sifted through hundreds of pages of pawn shop records, interview transcripts, and surveillance footage, desperately trying to connect the dots. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but with each revelation, the scope of the operation became clearer and darker. The bodies, once believed to be connected to isolated incidents, were now being linked to a much larger criminal enterprise. The more the FBI uncovered, the more it became clear that the gold and silver pawn shop was more than just a pawn shop. It was a hub for a criminal network that had been operating under the radar for years. The FBI's agents began to believe that the shop had been used as a front for laundering money, trafficking stolen goods, and potentially even engaging in more sinister activities. The first breakthrough came when the forensic team finally identified the last of the bodies. The victim was a man named Eddie Jackson, a well-known figure in Las Vegas for his connections to underground casinos and illegal gambling operations. Eddie had been missing for nearly a decade, and his disappearance had been quietly swept under the rug, with no real investigation into what had happened to him. But now, with his body found beneath the Pawn Stars floor, everything had changed. Rick and Corey Harrison were stunned when they learned that Eddie Jackson had been one of the bodies discovered beneath their shop. They had known Eddie, or at least seen him around the pawn shop over the years, but they had never imagined that he had been connected to something so dark. Eddie had been a regular customer, often bringing in valuable items to sell, but Rick had always believed him to be just another eccentric businessman with a taste for the extraordinary. He had never suspected that Eddie was involved in illegal activities. As the FBI delved deeper into Eddie's background, they uncovered disturbing links to organized crime syndicates operating in Las Vegas. Eddie Jackson was not just a regular gambler. He was an enforcer for a major criminal organization, using the pawn shop as a way to launder money and hide illicit goods. The items Eddie had brought into the shop were not what they appeared. Some were stolen, others were contraband, but all of them had been processed through the pawn shop with the help of corrupt individuals working within the business. The more the FBI uncovered about Eddie's connections, the more they realized that his death was not a random occurrence. It was clear that Eddie had been targeted, likely because he knew too much or had become a liability to the organization he worked for. And whoever had hidden his body beneath the Pawn Stars shop had done so with purpose, hoping to erase the evidence of his involvement in the criminal enterprise. As investigators pieced together the circumstances surrounding Eddie's death, they began to suspect that the other bodies discovered beneath the floor were also connected to the same criminal network. The theory that the Pawn Stars shop had been used as a front for organized crime was no longer just a theory. It was becoming the prevailing explanation for the mystery behind the bodies. But even as the FBI uncovered more about the criminal ties to the pawn shop, there were still many unanswered questions. How deep did the involvement of Rick and Corey Harrison go? Had they unknowingly been part of the operation, or had they actively participated in it? The FBI was carefully examining every piece of evidence, hoping to find something that would clarify the extent of the Harrison family's involvement in the criminal network. For Rick and Corey, the investigation was beginning to feel like a nightmare that wouldn't end. They had built their lives around the Pawn Stars brand, and now everything they had worked for was under scrutiny. The shop, once a symbol of hard work and family, was now tainted with the shadow of criminality. Both men were facing public backlash and media speculation, with every new theory about the bodies and the pawn shop's involvement in organized crime spreading like wildfire. The TV show that had made them famous was now a liability, and their personal lives had been turned upside down. The FBI's investigation was far from over, and each new revelation brought them closer to the truth. The agents began to focus on the records of employees who had worked at the pawn shop over the years. They were particularly interested in those who had left under mysterious circumstances or who had been involved in strange dealings with customers who had disappeared. The list of potential suspects grew longer as the investigation continued, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to rule anyone out. One former employee, a man named Mark Donovan, was of particular interest to the FBI. Mark had worked at the Pawn Stars shop for several years before leaving abruptly and without explanation. He had been involved in several questionable transactions during his time at the shop, and his sudden departure raised red flags. The FBI suspected that Mark might have been more involved in the illegal activities surrounding the pawn shop than anyone had realized. As they dug deeper into his background, they discovered that he had a history of working with criminal organizations and had been linked to several high-profile smuggling operations in the past. Mark Donovan's name came up again and again as the FBI investigated the pawn shop's history. It seemed that he had been connected to several of the bodies found beneath the floor, and he was quickly becoming a prime suspect in the investigation. But finding Mark proved to be difficult. He had disappeared just as mysteriously as he had arrived at the pawn shop, and the FBI struggled to track him down. As the investigation continued, Rick and Corey were forced to confront the possibility that their shop had been used for far darker purposes than they had ever imagined. The evidence was mounting against them, and every new revelation only deepened the mystery. The more they learned about the criminal activities linked to the pawn shop, the more they wondered if they had been complicit in something much larger than they had ever imagined. Had they unknowingly helped launder money, traffic stolen goods, and support organized crime? Or had they been manipulated by people they trusted, unknowingly caught in the web of deceit and corruption that surrounded their family business? The FBI had no answers yet, but they were determined to find them. The investigation was far from over, and with each new lead, they were getting closer to uncovering the full scope of the operation. The secrets buried beneath the Pawn Stars shop were starting to surface, and Rick and Corey Harrison had no choice but to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. As the investigation into the gold and silver pawn shop continued, the FBI began to uncover connections that no one could have foreseen. What had seemed like an isolated case of hidden bodies beneath the floorboards of the shop was rapidly evolving into a complex web of criminal activity that had been going on for decades. And the more the agents dug into the shop's history, the more they began to realize that the Harrison family, Rick and Corey, were not the only ones involved. The bodies discovered beneath the floor were not just victims of random violence. They were part of a much larger, much darker story. The investigation began to uncover startling connections between the pawn shop and individuals who had once worked there or been associated with the business. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, the FBI found that the Pawn Stars shop had become a focal point for something far more sinister than anyone had imagined. One of the most shocking discoveries was the connection between the bodies and a network of illegal gambling rings that had been operating in Las Vegas for years. The FBI had long suspected that organized crime was active in the city, but the pawn shop's role in this underground world had remained hidden for so long. The more the FBI investigated, the more they realized that the shop had become a hub for laundering money and facilitating the movement of stolen goods. The theory that Rick and Corey Harrison had unknowingly been involved in illegal activity was beginning to seem less plausible. The more the FBI uncovered, the more it appeared that the Harrison family had been complicit in the criminal enterprise. But the truth was not as simple as it seemed. While it was clear that the shop had been involved in illegal activity, the question remained, how much did Rick and Corey actually know? And had they been victims of a much larger, more sophisticated operation? Or had they actively participated in the criminal activity? As the FBI dug deeper, they discovered that one of the key figures behind the pawn shop's involvement in illegal activity was a former employee named Richard Dick Matthews. Matthews had worked at the shop for several years before mysteriously disappearing. He was known for his knowledge of rare artifacts and valuable collectibles, but there was something else about him that raised suspicion. Matthews had been closely associated with individuals who had ties to organized crime, and his departure from the shop had been abrupt, with no real explanation. The FBI quickly learned that Matthews had been a key player in the criminal activities surrounding the Pawn Stars shop. He had used his position to launder money, traffic stolen goods, and facilitate illegal deals between the shop and various criminal organizations. His involvement in the operation had been far deeper than anyone had realized, and the more the FBI uncovered about his activities, the more it became clear that Matthews had been a central figure in the shop's hidden criminal network. What was even more troubling was the fact that Matthews had been closely connected to Rick and Corey Harrison. While there was no evidence that the two men had knowingly participated in Matthews' illegal activities, the FBI found that Matthews had played a key role in securing deals for the shop, often arranging for rare items to be brought in that were later sold for vast sums of money. Matthews had worked behind the scenes, brokering deals and facilitating transactions that were hidden from the public eye. As the FBI continued to follow the trail of evidence, they began to uncover other employees who had been involved in Matthews' operation. Some had left the shop under strange circumstances, while others had simply vanished without a trace. The connections between these former employees and the criminal underworld became increasingly clear, and the investigation began to take on an entirely new dimension. The more the FBI uncovered, the more they realized that the Pawn Stars shop was not just a pawn shop, it was a front for something much larger. The shop had become a central hub for the movement of stolen goods, black market artifacts, and even contraband. The Harrison family, whether knowingly or unknowingly, had become entangled in a vast criminal enterprise that stretched far beyond Las Vegas. For Rick and Corey, the realization that their shop had been used as a front for criminal activity was a bitter pill to swallow. They had spent years building a reputation for honesty and hard work, and now they were facing the harsh reality that their family business had been involved in something far darker than they could have ever imagined. It was hard for both men to accept that their shop, the place that had been a symbol of their success, had been used to facilitate illegal activity. But the evidence was undeniable. As the investigation moved forward, the FBI uncovered more connections between the Pawn Stars shop and the world of organized crime. They found that the shop had been involved in the movement of illegal weapons, stolen art, and counterfeit currency. The Harrison family had unknowingly become part of a network that spanned across the country, with connections to some of the most notorious criminals in Las Vegas and beyond. The more the FBI uncovered, the more it became clear that Rick and Corey had been unwitting pawns in a much larger game. The evidence suggested that Matthews, along with several other individuals, had used the shop as a cover for their illegal activities. The Harrison family had been taken advantage of, drawn into a world of crime that they had no part in creating. But the reality was that their shop had become a part of that world, and they were now facing the consequences of their involvement. The investigation into the Pawn Stars shop was beginning to take on a new urgency. The FBI had already uncovered a wealth of evidence linking the shop to criminal organizations, and they were now focused on dismantling the operation. They began to question everyone involved, from former employees to customers, trying to piece together the full extent of the criminal network that had operated under the radar for so long. For Rick and Corey, the ordeal was far from over. As they tried to clear their names, they were forced to confront the possibility that their involvement in the criminal enterprise went far deeper than they had initially realized. The shop that had once been a symbol of their success was now the center of a criminal investigation that threatened to tear apart their family and their business. As the investigation continued, the FBI began to uncover more and more evidence of the shop's connection to illegal activity. They found links to smuggling operations, drug trafficking, and even human trafficking. The extent of the criminal network was far larger than anyone had expected, and the Pawn Stars shop had played a central role in its operation. Rick and Corey were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The shop that had once been their pride and joy was now a symbol of corruption and deceit. They had built their success on a foundation of hard work and trust, but now that foundation was crumbling beneath their feet. The investigation was far from over, and as the FBI uncovered more and more details, it seemed that the secrets beneath the Pawn Stars shop were far darker than anyone could have imagined.